It was the spring of 1943. The Soviet troops had already recaptured an outpost of Malaya Zemlya in the area of Novorossiysk. In the Caucasus, the Red Army actively advanced, creating favorable conditions for a breakthrough of the so-called Gutenkampf, a robust system of Nazi fortifications in the lower course of the Kuban. A special role was assigned to the Soviet fighter pilots in the upcoming operation. In the air above the Kuban, they were to finish the prevalence of the German aviation, which limited the advance of the ground forces of the Red Army by its actions. It was the spring of 1943. The Liberators were to fight from their own sky. Sergei Gorolov, Vitaly Klemenko, Yuri Lovshevik, and others in Fighter Pilots of the Liberators series. Prior to the war in the USSR, only the cinema stars could contest the popularity of the pilots Gromov, Chokolov, Kakanaki. In the USSR, any trade related to machinery was considered prestigious, and the person able to fly an airplane was especially well regarded and respected. The aviators' chests were covered with orders, which were quite rare at the time, and the youth strived to get to the sky. Primary training of pilots took place in flying clubs. From there, the graduates were sent to flight schools. In the middle of the 1930s, the period of the pilots' training was 2.5 years, and by the spring of 1941 it was condensed to the maximum due to the increase of the air forces in number. The programs of schools included theoretical training and flying practice only. Young pilots should have had around 50 hours of independent flying of all types of aircraft. In the morning of 22 June 1941, the first strike of the Nazi aircraft was intended to the Soviet aerodromes. In the first hour of Barbarossa operation, around 800 Soviet aircraft and a significant number of border warehouses with ammunition and fuel were destroyed. Sergei Gorolov recollects. 3 regiments were concentrated at the aerodrome. Around 200 airplanes. At night, we were bombed. We woke up, ran to the aerodrome, and there, almost all the planes had been either destroyed or damaged. Still, some of our pilots were able to meet the enemy properly. In the first day of the war, the Soviet fighter pilots reported about destroying 200 Nazi aircraft. The best results were shown by Lieutenant Ivan Kalabushkin. On 22 June, he brought down 2 Messerschmitts, 2 Junkers, and 1 Heinkel. However, such success was just sporadic. To compare, the Nazi pilots had around 400 Soviet aircraft brought down on record. The reasons for that was unexpectedness of the strike, absence of flight experience for the majority of the Soviet pilots, and disadvantages of the equipment. Alexander Shvaryov recollects. A group of Heinkel 111 aircraft was approaching us. We flew to them, shot, but the problem was that MiG-3 had BS machine guns, which often seized. How? And they did not shoot anymore. And we were being shot at. Upon the first flight, around 40 holes were counted in my airplane. The Nazi Messerschmitt prevailed over the main fighters of the Red Army, I-16 and I-153 in speed and firepower. The Nazi prevalence was increased by artful management of air forces and perfect radio communication between airplanes and with the ground. But even in such a desperate situation, the Soviet pilots squeezed everything possible from their quite outdated aircraft and won the first victories. According to the German data, from 22 June until 19 July 1941, the Air Force of Germany, Luftwaffe, lost around 1,300 aircraft of all types. However, the 5,000 aircraft used in the first months of the war provided the Nazi military leaders with complete prevalence in the air. With the beginning of the spring of 1942, new battles awaited the Soviet pilots. Sergei Gorlov recollects. The spring and summer of 1942 were the most horrible days of the war. There was a heat wave. You could not get out of the cabin while the airplane was fueled for a new flight. A girl could bring you a glass of compote, and there was nothing else you could wish. It was especially hard for the Soviet fighter pilots in the sky of the Battle of Rossiya, where they fought with the Nazi Eagles of Melder's fleet. The pilots who had had the school of 1941 and having their own tactics of fighting were able to stay alive in hot sky battles. Vitaly Klemenko recollects. If an air fight began, 2 of ours left the lines and went up. As soon as they saw that a Nazi ran to our pilot, they fell down to the Nazi. They did not have to attack. It was enough to demonstrate a trace or streak in front of his nose, and he left the attack. If it was possible to bring him down, we did it, but the most important thing was to dislodge him from the attacking position. It was not easier in the sky of Stalingrad. Stepan Mikoyan recollects. The casualties were immense there, 16 persons and 25 planes in 2 weeks of the war, but we brought down 82 Nazi planes. It should be said that our experienced pilots were brought down there. At that time, losses of the personnel were huge. The turning point teethed by the end of 1942 only. The Soviet factories evacuated began to deliver more and more airplanes to the troops. In 1942, the Soviet industry manufactured 10,000 fighter planes only. 2,000 more were received under the Land Lease. But during the second year of the war, the Soviet air forces were far from beating the Luftwaffe as equals. The system of the Nazi pilots were considered to be one of the best ones in the world. Carefully selected volunteers became the Luftwaffe pilots. Young Nazi pilots came to the unit having the experience of over 250 flight hours. Upon distribution to the combat unit, the pilot got to the reserve group where he mastered his skills of air fight and firing under the guidance of instructors with battle experience. After that, the decision of his readiness to fight was made. In 1943, the Soviet fighter pilots had to fight against the perfectly trained Nazi pilots at Tamen, near Gotenkampf. Gotenkampf was the Nazi name for their main most equipped position in the lower course of the Kuban. The Wehrmacht began to construct it in February 1943, and a huge defense belt was created in 4 months with its right flank reaching the Black Sea and its left flank reaching the Azov Sea flooded areas. Having broken through Gotenkampf, the Soviet troops came to the center of Tamen Peninsula. However, the prevailing Luftwaffe limited the advance of the Red Army. By the time of the battles, beginning at Tamen, qualitative changes happened in the training of the Soviet pilots, but the program of the flight schools was still limited to the minimum. At that time, pilots were sent to reserve aviation regiments, where they trained using the types of aircraft they were expected to fight on prior to going to the front. There, the instructors and front pilots shared their battle experience with the yesterday's students. In the combat regiment, the novice was checked as to his flight technique. Young pilots made several circles on the training fighter plane with an instructor. If there were no remarks as to the flight, the novice was permitted to fly independently. Then, mastering of group flights of pairs and flights began. At the beginning of the war, the Soviet fighter flight consisted of 3 planes which formed the Latin letter V while flying. This order, which looked nice at the parade, demonstrated its failure in the first days of the war. Vitaly Klemenko recollects. While meeting the enemy's fighter planes, our three-plane flight fell apart immediately while in the case of the very first U-turn. The left one had to decelerate his fighter plane, which is absolutely unacceptable in an air fight. The Nazis used the flight consisting of two pairs of fighter planes. In the pair, there were the leader and the flown. The task of the leader was to attack the enemy plane while the flown one covered him and controlled that the enemy's plane did not come to the leader from the rear. The Soviet pilots began to use the Nazi tactics from the first year of the war. The young pilot was placed as the flown one to the experienced pilot, which significantly increased his chances to survive. Yuri Movshevik recollects. We were told as follows. Whatever happens, you should keep next to the leader. If the pair does not break down, there remains a chance that you will stay alive. But the most important thing was that the middle of the war, almost each squadron had experienced air fighters. Under their guidance, the young fighter pilots had to make their first flights over Gotenkampf in the sky of Kuban. The majority of frontline aerodromes were unpaved. A flat field was used for them and marked with flags. The main sign for landing approach was a large letter T made of two blankets. The plane landed windward, along the T-leg to its crossbar, and the components of this sign were used to signal to the pilot. A broken T meant the landing plane had a faulty undercart. A T which became an L meant the left or right gear leg did not come out. The cross made of blankets prohibited landing. If another line appeared above the crossbar of the T, the pilots read the signal. All the planes shall land immediately. As a rule, pilots lived in villages 3 or 4 kilometers away from the aerodrome. The biggest house was emptied, and a squadron was placed there, 12 pilots. Plank beds were made in the house. Straws were placed on them and covered with tarpaulin. Each pilot was given a blanket. Those were all the bedding. In the minutes of rest between flights, pilots studied maps of flight's areas. Anatoly Bordin recollects. In any place where we stopped, the technicians made the hostilities area map on the ceiling. We drew maps of additional areas on ovens and walls. Respectively, when we rested, we looked at those maps freely or involuntarily and remembered. The technical personnel was accommodated in earth houses next to the aerodrome. If there were no villages in the proximity, pilots had to live in the earth houses as well. Pilots were fed quite well, according to the intensified Form 5, in a dining room where they were served by waiters. Often when flights were one after another, lunch was brought to the plane immediately. The ration included butter, sugar, and chocolate. For the case of a forced landing, the cabin had reserved food consisting of chocolate, cans with condensed milk, stew meat, and hard biscuits. Pilots received vodka as well, but only after battle flights, 100 grams before dinner. Grigory Krivosheyev recollects. The commander of the squadron began to pour into glasses. If you received 100 grams, it meant you earned that. If a bit more, you completed your task perfectly. If less, then you flew bad. All that was done silently. Everybody knew that that was the evaluation of the action for the past day. But prior to flying out, the majority of pilots preferred not to drink alcohol. Sergei Gorolov recollects. The one who drank was brought down as a rule. A drunk person has problems with reaction. And what is a battle? If you do not bring down, then you will be brought down yourself. I never flew drunk. Pilots were also given Russian cigarettes. As a rule, Bellamore, 1 pack a day. Anatoly Bordin recollects. The majority of our pilots exchanged their cigarettes into rustic tobacco with technicians. One could get high with tobacco immediately in order not to wish to smoke during the flight. A lot of pilots believed in omens. For example, prior to battle flights, they preferred not to shave and not to take photos of each other. The last flight in a day was called not last, but outermost. Sergei Gorilov recollects, "It was forbidden to shave in the morning, only in the evening. A wold could not be allowed to the plane cabin as well. My mother sewed a cross into my shirt. I put it into other shirts later on." Allotment money given to the fighter pilots they mostly sent to the relatives in the rear. The possibility to spend money for oneself happened very rarely. The principal Soviet fighter planes in 1941 were I-153 and I-16. Both planes had been designed at Polikarpov's design bureau, and they had wonderful flight characteristics in the 1930s, but they managed to become outdated by the beginning of the war. I-16 was called a donkey, and the Nazis named it Rada, a rat. The plane was difficult to flight, especially during takeoff and landing, but experienced pilots liked the machine. Vladimir Tikomarov recollects, "If you learned how to fly the I-16, then you could fly anything, even a stick. A very demanding plane, but extremely maneuverable." The Seswa plane, I-153 called a Gull, had a more archaic model than the I-16. The Gull had a worse aerodynamic speed, but it was compensated by simplicity of control. However, the first weeks of the war demonstrated uselessness of the Gulls, and forced to transfer those planes to the Storm and light bombardment regiments. The principal Nazi fighter plane was Messerschmitt Bf-109. This plane had a thin, spindled body and was in sharp contrast with the donkey with a forehead. It is not by occasion that the Soviet pilots named it Thin, and in private conversations called them Schmitts or Messers. With better maneuverability and comparable ammunition, the I-16 was behind the Messerschmitt as to the speed. The Soviet pilots had to defend from the very beginning, and the enemy could force an action any time or leave it and take the favorable position again. The Nazi fighter pilot Erich Hartmann, who flew the Messerschmitt from the autumn of 1942 until the end of the war, used the tactics with the maximum efficiency. The 352 victories in the air claimed by him enabled him to become the most successful ace in the history of aviation. Usually he got up and selected the most appropriate victim in the group of the Soviet planes. As a rule, that was a plane lagging behind the group or flown by young pilots which the experienced hunter saw without any mistakes. Then, everything happened following the same scenario as a rule. A nosedive attack, shooting short range, and leaving to a safe height to select a new victim. However, the tactics were the same for the best aces on both sides of the front. The majority of the pilots brought down did not even have time to understand what happened, and the lucky ones who survived ascribed the aces' attack to the plane failure or attack from the ground. At the beginning of the war, Soviet flight units began to receive new planes, Yak-1, MiG-3, Lag-3, later Yak-7. By the beginning of 1942, they were positively different from the donkeys and gulls, but had a lot of drawbacks. Absence of the principal material to produce planes, duralumin, resulted in the planes being made mostly of wood and plywood.
Но дерево обладает меньшим...
But wood has a lower unit strength than metal. In other words, wood-bearing members with equal strength were heavier than the metal ones, which resulted in an increase of the plane weight and decreased its speed in the end.
Кроме того, недостаток...
Besides, absence of the qualified workers resulted in the fact that the quality of assembly of the planes was very low. None of them could fight equally with the Messerschmitts. By the autumn of 1942, new fighter planes, Yak-9 of Yakovlev's design bureau and La-5 of Lavochkin's design bureau arrived to the troops. The quality of the planes was still insufficient, but they were already able to fight the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that appeared at the Eastern Front almost equally. It is Lavochkin fighter planes that the entire battle carrier of the most efficient Soviet fighter pilot, Ivan Nikitovich Kozetov, is connected with. Having begun in the spring of 1943, he brought down 63 Nazi planes in 120 air battles and had 3 titles of the Hero of the Soviet Union at the age of 25. The modifications of La-5F and La-5FN, which improved aerodynamics and more powerful engines, were already better than the German planes produced at the time. However, the best Soviet fighter planes of the war were La-7 and Yak-3. The 1st Regiment of LA-7 arrived to the front in September 1944 only. The plane had a metal wing spar instead of the wood one, which provided economy of weight of 80 kilograms immediately. Additionally, the flaps completely covered the wheels in the closed position. Complete internal sealing of the body had been carried out. Even with the nominal speed of the engine, La-7 had a higher speed than the newest German Focke-Wulf. And if the pilot of La-7 turned on the afterburning, then the Nazi pilot had no chances against him at the heights of up to 2,000 meters. The ammunition of La-7 included 2 guns installed in the body. Fire was provided across the plane of the propeller spin. For the cartridges not to break the propeller during firing, the guns were equipped with synchronizers, which enabled the cartridges to fly between the spinning blades. The fighter plane Yak-3 was mostly better than later modifications of the Messerschmitt. By the end of the war, the role of the fighter planes supplied by the Allies under the Land-Lease decreased significantly. The British Hurricanes lived out their remaining days. Spitfires that were considered height planes, according to the Soviet standards, were sent to the anti-aircraft. Kitty Hawks stayed in the sea aviation. The American Airacobras were liked by the Soviet pilots most. In the spring of 1943, during the storm of Gotenkampf, they performed quite well. Another famous Soviet ace flew the Airacobra in the sky of Taman. That was thrice hero Alexander Ivanovich Pokrishkin. The air forces of the USSR at Taman were in a disadvantaged position to the enemy's aviation if to consider the number of planes. A lot of aviation units had the outdated I-16 and I-153. A lot of planes required repair. At the beginning of April 1943, it rained heavily at the Kuban. Water flooded the trenches and artillery positions. Filled aerodromes became unusable for takeoff and landing of Po-2. Dense fog covered the ground for the whole day, leaving the aviation aside. Upon the winter battles, it was calm at the front. The Soviet troops were getting ready for an offensive. The enemy strengthened the defense. Taking into consideration the ratio of the aviation, the General Headquarters sent several aviation bodies of troops equipped with new planes to Taman. Concentration of reserve aviation bodies of troops began of the 3rd Fighter Aviation Corps of General Major Savitsky and of the 287th Fighter Aviation Division of Brigadier General Danilov. The 201st Fighter Aviation Division of General Major Zhukov began fighting near Novorossiysk. In the air of the Kuban, the units will destroy the myth of the Nazi prevalence in the air in 2 months of battles. For the first time from the beginning of the war, there were aviation pointers, representatives of the aviation units who reported the situation in the air and on the ground by radio immediately to the regiments, as well as requests of the ground commanders about support from the air at the front line in abundance. With the flight weather, the pilots were at the aerodrome. Anatoly Bordin recollects, "We keep sitting in our planes for an hour, then leave them. Then another squadron is on duty. All of us in a row did that." Having received the task, the regiment commander set a task to the pilots. Then they went to their planes. Technicians reported about readiness of planes to fly.
Летчики использовали кожаные шлемы с
Pilots used leather helmets with headsets. Mask microphones, which were attached separately, played the role of the microphone while connecting to the ground. Unlike German helmets, the Soviet ones had additional belts on the sides, which kept the flight goggles in place. The winter helmets of the Soviet pilots were usually winterized with dog coat, of the Nazi pilots with sheepskin.
а немецкие – овчины. Летчики, как правило,
As a rule, pilots flew in boots and shirts, wearing their medals, and sometimes in one-piece garments.
А зимой
In winter, pilots were provided with high fur boots and leather fur jackets, but not everybody put on a jacket with a fur collar.
надевали носы.
Grigory Krivosheyev recollects, "The fighter pilot has to see, in the first place, what is going on behind him, but there was nothing to be seen with a fur collar. I gave the jacket to the technician and flew in a shirt. In the cabin it was very warm while we closed the canopy always. If you're brought down, you'll freeze, but it did not matter. I'm alive because my head could turn, probably." The pilot got into the cabin. His parachute was attached on long belts and put to a seat niche in the seat in such a manner that the pilot sat on the parachute. The pilot had to attach himself with waist and shoulder belts, but a lot of pilots used only waist belts to preserve mobility and to control the space in the air. Following the signal of the green light, planes began to take off, one by one, or in pair. In the air, the pilot had to turn his head all the time by 360 degrees. In the air, the one that saw the enemy first won, and it happened that while controlling the air, pilots rubbed their necks against the shirt collar until it bled. To avoid that, pilots were supposed to have silk underwear, but it did not get to the units quite often. A lot of German, British, and French pilots wore silk scarves not to show off at all. The air battles began anew at Taman during the offensive of the Soviet troops to Krymskaya Cossack village. The beginning of the offensive in the night of 29 April 1943 was preceded by the attacks of the Soviet aviation against the Nazi positions. 144 bombers, 84 attack planes, and 265 fighters participated in them. The principal military operation deployed on the ground, of course, and the task of the aviation was, in the first place, to support the ground troops. Bombers and attack planes attacked ground aims, and fighters protected them from the enemy's planes. Accompanying P-2 bombers, pawns, as they were called by the pilots, fighter planes flew in a special formation. The speed of bombers were around 350 kilometers per hour. The attacking Messerschmitts could speed up to 600 kilometers per hour. And to defeat their attack, the Soviet fighter planes had to keep the speed of at least 450 kilometers per hour and not to fly in front of their own bombers. Scissors or swing were used to that end. A part of the fighter planes went to the right, 600 to 700 meters above the planes accompanied, and went to the left with speeding up and coming down, coming to the same height with which the acceleration began. The fighters which flew on the left carried out the same maneuver to the opposite side. Then they changed their places. When the bombers entered the bombing area, the fighters changed their formation to the stand, splitting into three groups. One group remained above the bombers, protecting them against an attack from above. The second group was on duty in the area of bombing at the height of the bombers nosediving. The third one was at the height of coming out of nosediving. From where the enemy tried to come to the formation of P2, the fighters began a battle with the enemy's planes, not letting them to the pawns. Attack planes were accompanied in a bit different manner. Attack planes I-12 flew at the height of 2,000 meters maximum, and fighters in pairs covering the I-1s on the left and right and from above. Keeping the high speed, Yaks went in zigzags, controlling the surrounding area all the time. Vitaly Klemenko recollects, "It is more difficult to cover attack planes than to cover bombers. They fly very low. I cannot fly next to them or I'll be brought down. If you fly higher, you cannot see them, and against the forest or snow, you can lose them quite easily." Having reached the aim, the I-1s made a circle and destroyed the aim in several approaches. At the same time, fighters flew 500 higher and to a side, observing the air carefully. Upon the attack, the group formed the previous battle order. The Nazi fighters could appear at any time. Ivan Kozhemyako recollects, "Usually the Messers flew around 500 meters higher than Yaks. They formed a wide circle, selecting the proper moment to attack. Then the attack of a single Messer followed at the maximum speed in a steep nosedive, most often from the side of the sun against the back I-1. Having noticed the attack, a pair of Soviet fighters separated from the group and fired at the Messer, making it stop the attack. The Soviet pilots did not follow the enemy's plane. They had the task not to bring the enemy's plane down, but to protect the attack planes. Discipline in such actions was strictly kept. If the Messerschmitts damaged the I-1 significantly, fighter pilots were to have a disciplinary punishment up to the tribunal. Even if the enemy's plane was brought down, that would not decrease the punishment. The task of protecting the ground forces against the Nazi bombardments, in other words, intercepting the Nazi bombers, was the second task of the fighters. There were 6 planes combat ready with the commander of the squadron at the front aerodrome. When a signal from the advanced observation posts arrived concerning appearance of a group of Junkers, the Soviet fighters took off. The Battle 4 were led by the squadron commander. His aim was bombers. 300 to 400 meters higher, the covering pair of the deputy commander and his wingman flew with the task to fight back the attacks of the Nazi fighters. Vitaly Klemenko recollects, "It happened that the ground station led you and you could not see the enemy's group. You were nervous as if you were blind. The enemy was somewhere, maybe ready to attack, and you could not see him. You acted flaky. When you saw him, you were fine." The lead noticed creeping black spots low in front, a group of Nazi bombers. The squadron commander did not know yet that, following the Junkers, the covering Messerschmitts were taking off. The Soviet pair observed the airspace, and the squadron commander led his 4 to the front attack of the main bomber. The attack with the head-on required from the pilot self-restraint and proper training. There was too little time to aim and shoot. The enemy's plane grew in sight unbelievably quickly. The approach speed was around 1,000 kilometers per hour. Fire from all the weapons, and the Junkers went down. The enemy did not give a second chance to attack the bombers. A pair of the Messerschmitts started a battle with the Soviet covering pair, having reached their height. The pilot leaving the pair who managed to hang on the tail of the enemy has prevalence in the air battle. The fighter followed the leaving plane, getting it in sight and fired at the proper moment. It was extremely difficult to hit a small, constantly maneuvering fighter. The pilot saw the outline of the enemy's plane from the tail only, which appeared and disappeared in the crosswires. But it was difficult for the enemy to get away from such following. The wrong maneuver, loss of speed, and the enemy was at the firing distance. At the same time, the pursuer risked to be attacked by another plane of the enemy. Having concentrated on the attack, the wingman had to help the leader to attack, not to permit the enemy's fighter to it. It followed its commander plane being 100 to 150 meters behind all the time, as if tied with an invisible string to it. With its fire, the wingman fought back the enemy's attacks from the leader's tail. At the same time, he had to remember what happened behind its back. Even attacking, the experienced leader always kept the wingman in sight. He could see that the wingman was attacked by the Messerschmitt and could get out of the attack with an attack heading turnover. The wingman made the same maneuver, following it and saving it from pursuit and death. Attention to each other, care about the colleague, of the leader as well as the wingman, were the essence of success in the battle. Konstantin Zhanaryov recollects. I was the wingman of the hero of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Zaburin. Kolka was quite well. He was a good commander. Owing to him, I remained alive and had no single scratch in the whole war. I was suggested going to a different squadron as the senior pilot, but I did not want to. The most intense air battles for prevalence in the air of the Kuban continued for 2 weeks. New planes entered the battle, and the disengaged returned to the aerodrome, refueled, and took off again, sometimes up to 4 to 5 times a day. Battles and sharp turns happened at low speeds. This stripped the Nazi pilots of the Messerschmitts of their main advantage. Lavochkins and Yaks had as many chances to win as the enemy in the speedy Messer. But one of the Soviet fighters was set on fire by a burst of the Messer. The pilot tried to get to his own territory because it meant to die or get captured if he jumped with his parachute above the defensive position of the enemy. There were no automatic systems of escape from the plane. Jumping out of the cabin, it was possible to hit the stabilizer. For that not to happen, the pilot unbuckled his belts, moved the canopy back with his hands, moved his legs to the seat, and moved the actuating lever forward sharply. The plane dived down. An airstream rushed into the cabin and took the pilot out. Hero of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorelov recollects. It was dangerous, but there were many variants to avoid the stabilizer. It was possible to open the canopy and turn upside down, or to place the plane sideways. The main thing was to create a negative overload. Otherwise, you could not get out. Most often, you did not know how you jumped out. Leaving the plane, the pilot could catch on it with the parachute canopy or lines. To avoid this, it was necessary to wait for a couple of minutes and then pull the ring. But sometimes the pilot had no time left, and sometimes it happened that the thread pulling the parachute was cut by a bullet or a frag. It was very complicated to bring down the Nazi bomber. The plane protected with gunfire did not permit the fighter to approach it. But again, the main task of the fighters was not to bring down the enemy's planes, but to break the formation and make the junkers drop the bombs, not reaching their aim. The Nazi bombers often did it that way when they were deprived of protection and attacked. And there were flights of the so-called free hunting. Unlike in the Luftwaffe, in the Soviet Air Force, this was a rare occasion. Only the best pilots did it when the situation did not require their performance of other tasks. Alexander Shvarev recollects. Only by the second half of the war we began to hunt freely. Free hunting is just the best flights. You're not attached to anything. You just fly. Your task is to catch airheads and shoot. Hunting was carried out by 2 pairs as a rule. Having attacked the enemy, the hunters left immediately, but there could be an air fight if the situation was in their favor. Returning from the task, the pilots returned the plane to the technician and reported to the commander about the task completion. The fact of destroying the enemy plane always required a confirmation from the pilot himself or from the immediate participants of the battle. Sometimes evidence of the ground observers was required. However, during the air battle, it was particularly impossible to follow the destiny of the enemy defeated, and the ground observer had it difficult to determine who had brought the plane down. That is why it happened that a lot of planes considered to be brought down according to all the rules successfully returned to their aerodromes. At the end of the war, a lot of fighters had gun cameras installed which enabled it to determine the air victory or its absence more precisely. In the Soviet aviation, there was a division of air battles into two categories: personnel and group ones. At the beginning of the war, when inability to cooperate in the air battle became one of the major reasons for losses, collective actions of pilots were encouraged. That is why all the planes brought down were often considered to be in the group category, to the account of all the participants of the battle. With each and every day, pilots got more and more experience, developed the tactics of air battles, were the winners of one-on-one battles more often. In some regiments, the decision was made to consider a part of the group battles as personal, with a ratio of 1 to 2. And later, a system of decorations and monetary remunerations directly connected to the number of victories appeared in the army. Thus, the pilot with 5 personal and 25 group victories turned into an ace with 15 personal and 5 group victories, which made him, in the second half of the war, a candidate to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union automatically. A pilot received a remuneration of 2,000 rubles for a bomber brought down, 1,500 rubles for a transport plane, and 1,000 rubles for a fighter. The Lenin Order is the highest decoration of the USSR. It was awarded for the exceptional achievement and special merits before the Soviet state and society, for achievements in work and protection of the motherland. The first decoration with the Lenin Order occurred in May 1930. Komsomolskaya Pravda was awarded the order following the resolution of the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee by the 5th anniversary. Established in 1930, the Lenin Order changed several times during the period of its existence, as well as many other orders and medals. On 19 June 1943, the order received an eye in the top part of the sign, to which a pentagonal suspension was attached with a ring. All the orders previously issued were subject to reissue of the new award with preservation of the serial number. The new order was made of gold and platinum. Replacement of the orders was continued upon the Great Patriotic War as well. During the period of the Great Patriotic War, over 40,000 persons were decorated with the highest order of the country. Of them, around 36,000 received the decoration for battle record. The Marshal of the Soviet Union, Troikov, and the famous North Pole explorer, Papanin, were decorated with the order 9 times. 10 Lenin Orders decorated the chest of the famous aircraft designer, Yakovlev. The Lenin Order was awarded in case of awarding the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union, together with the Gold Star Medal and Certificate of Merit of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Hero of the Soviet Union, Alexander Dudakov. A lot of pilots said about the Lenin Order that it was possible to receive for milking cows and for battles. That is why they preferred to be decorated with the Red Banner Order. It was estimated highly, but I estimate both highly. In the battle for Taman Peninsula, the General Headquarters used the air forces of up to 2,500 aircraft in the narrow section of the front in the spring of 1943. Almost half of them were fighters. In the battles for Krymskaya railway hub, the Soviet aviation completed the task determined, having destroyed 368 aircraft of the enemy. The front armies broke down the enemy's defense, and on 5 May, liberated Krymskaya Cossack village, an important center of the enemy's defense. A real possibility of defeating the whole Kuban group of the Nazis was created. During the air fight for Kuban, the traits of the new tactics of the aviation use were determined. The tactics were used in the further operations of the Soviet troops. The Soviet fighters completed the tasks set to them wonderfully. They protected the battlefield and ensured the operation of the strike aircraft. On 16 September, Novorossiysk was liberated. This meant breaking down the Gutenkopf. The Nazi troops had to retreat from the whole territory of Taman under the threat of enveloping. Before them were the most complicated battles in the air of the Kursk Bulge, air battles above Ukraine, the Belarus, Moldova, and the Baltic. But it was in the Kuban area where the Soviet fighter pilots felt sure of their strength for the first time. And by the end of the war, the air forces of the USSR were considered to be one of the strongest in the world.